The first time I saw her, she was nothing but a shadow in the moonlight, half conscious, bloodied, and clutching a torn piece of fabric that had once been part of a dress. I had been out hunting that evening, chasing a wounded deer through the dense pines when I stumbled upon her near the creek. Her skin glowed bronze in the cold light, her hair matted and tangled with leaves. She looked young, but her eyes, though barely open, carried the weight of 100 winters. I didn't know what to do at first. She wasn't from my settlement, that much was clear. I had heard of the Apache bands that roamed these lands, proud and fierce people who kept to their own and wanted nothing from the settlers that were slowly pressing west. But seeing her like that, broken and shivering, there wasn't any choice to make. I lifted her into my arms, her small frame surprisingly heavy with exhaustion, and carried her back to my cabin by the ridge. By the time I laid her on the cot by the fire, she was barely breathing. I worked quickly, boiled water, cleaned her wounds, and used strips of my own shirt to bind them. I didn't know if she would live till morning. The storm outside howled like the spirits of the mountains, and I sat there all night, watching her chest rise and fall in uneven rhythm, afraid that if I blinked too long, I'd lose her to the cold. When dawn came, the first light of day touched her face, and for the first time, I saw how beautiful she was. Not in the way of the girls back east, painted and soft, but in a wild, untamed way. Her cheekbones were high, her lips cracked but full, her features proud even in sleep. I wondered who she was before the woods took her, what her story was, what tribe she came from, and who she might have lost. For 2 days, she didn't wake. I gave her water with a spoon and whispered words she couldn't understand. On the 3rd day, her eyes opened. They were dark as obsidian and just as sharp. She flinched at the sight of me, tried to sit up, but pain shot through her side, and she gasped, clutching her ribs. I raised my hands slowly, showing her I meant no harm. "You're safe," I said, though I doubted she understood English. "No one's gonna hurt you here." She stared at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, weakly, she sank back against the cot. The tension in the room settled, replaced by a fragile quiet. I left her some water and stepped outside to chop wood, giving her space. Every few minutes, I'd glance back through the window to make sure she hadn't disappeared. But she stayed. By evening, she had eaten a little broth, though she refused to speak. Her eyes followed me everywhere, wary and alert, like a wild animal deciding if the hand that fed it would also strike. That night, as the fire crackled low, I fell asleep in the chair beside her, exhausted. When I woke the next morning, the light was dim, and I felt something heavy pressing against me. I blinked, disoriented, and froze. She was on top of me. Her knees were on either side of my waist, her hands pressed against my chest. Her hair fell like a dark curtain around her face, her expression fierce and unyielding. For a second, I thought she meant to harm me. My hand instinctively went to my knife, but then I stopped when I saw her eyes. They weren't angry. They were searching. She spoke then, in halting English, her voice low and strained. "Why, you help?" The question hit me like a stone. I hadn't expected her to speak, let alone ask that. I opened my mouth, searching for an answer that made sense, but none came. Finally, I said, "Because you needed it." She studied me, her brow furrowed as if trying to decide whether I was telling the truth. Then, slowly, she climbed off me and sat by the fire, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. The tension eased, though her question lingered in the air between us like smoke. Over the next few days, she began to speak more. Broken phrases, bits of words she must have learned from traders or settlers. Her name, I learned, was Ayana. It meant, eternal blossom. She had been captured by raiders 2 weeks before I found her. They had taken her people's horses and burned their camp. She'd escaped during the night, but the wilderness had not been kind to her. As her strength returned, so did her spirit. I'd catch her watching me as I worked, splitting logs, tending the fire, mending tools. Sometimes, when she thought I wasn't looking, she'd touch the bandages I'd made, tracing them as if trying to understand why a stranger would care for her. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, she came to me with a question that stopped me in my tracks. Why you live alone? I didn't have a simple answer. Lost people, I said after a moment. Wife, son. Fever took them back east. I came here to start over. She was silent for a long time. Then she said softly, you help me. Maybe I help you. I smiled faintly. Maybe you already have. From that night on, something changed between us. She began helping with chores, gathering herbs, teaching me names of plants in her tongue. We spoke little, but there was an understanding that went beyond words. I showed her how to set traps. She showed me which roots were safe to eat. Slowly, the cabin felt less like a place of exile and more like home. Winter came early that year. Snow piled against the door, and the nights stretched long and silent. We spent those months surviving side by side, sharing warmth and quiet laughter. Sometimes she'd tell me stories, of her people, of the spirits in the mountains, of how every star carried a soul watching from the other side. I listened, mesmerized, realizing how small my world had been before she walked into it. But peace never lasts long on the frontier. One afternoon, while I was out checking traps, I saw smoke rising from the east, thin, dark, and out of place. My gut turned to ice. When I returned, Ayana was standing by the window, bow in hand, eyes sharp. They come, she said simply. 3 riders appeared through the trees, armed and rough-looking. Not Apache, white men, hunters or drifters. One of them shouted as they dismounted. We're looking for an Indian girl. Heard one's been hidin' out here. I felt my blood boil. I stepped out onto the porch, my rifle in hand. Ain't nobody here but me. They didn't believe me. One of them spat on the ground. We saw her tracks. Don't lie, friend. Before I could speak again, an arrow whistled past my ear and struck the man square in the chest. He crumpled without a sound. The others turned in shock, but Ayana was already beside me. Another arrow knocked. Go, she hissed. The fight that followed was brief and brutal. By the time it was over, the snow was red, and the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the distant cry of a hawk. We buried them under the pines before dusk, neither of us speaking a word. That night, as the wind moaned through the cracks in the cabin, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Ayana sat across from me, her bow resting beside her. After a long silence, she said, now you know why I run. I nodded slowly. You don't have to run anymore. She looked at me, her gaze softening. You help me. I help you. We both run before. Maybe no more. Something in her tone made my chest ache. I wanted to reach out, to tell her how much she meant to me, how she'd filled the emptiness I thought would never fade. But before I could speak, she rose and came to kneel beside me. Her hand rested lightly on my arm. You good man, she said. Simply. Spirit see you. Then, To my surprise, she leaned forward and rested her forehead against mine, a gesture both tender and ancient. In that moment, words were useless. Everything that needed to be said was already there, in the warmth between us, in the silence that wrapped around our hearts. We stayed together through that winter and the next. When spring came, she took me to meet what was left of her people, a small band that had survived the raids and moved farther into the hills. They welcomed me, wary at first, but Ayana's presence eased their fears. Over time, I learned their ways, their stories, their songs. Years later, when people asked how a lone trapper came to live among the Apache, I'd tell them the truth, that once, I found a woman half dead by a creek, and when I woke the next morning, she was on top of me, asking a question that changed my life. Why you help? And the answer, I learned, was simple. Because helping her had saved me, too.